They hunted him like a ghost across 30 miles of dust. Yet by sunrise, those same men would kneel in silence at a widow's door. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe in justice that rides quiet, hit like and follow. Now, back to the story. The wind moved slow across Red Hollow, dragging fine red dirt along the ground like it had nowhere better to be. Eleanor Hayes stood on her porch, one hand resting against the weathered wood frame, watching the empty road stretch out past her fence line. She had learned long ago that silence out here wasn't peace. It was warning. 12 years alone had taught her that. 12 years since the fire took everything but her name. The town sat 3 miles east, but it might as well have been another world. No one came this far unless they meant to, and no one stayed long if they didn't understand what solitude cost. The sun had dropped low, casting long shadows across the dry grass, when she heard it. Not a voice, not a shout, just the uneven rhythm of boots scraping dirt. Then a figure appeared at the edge of her property, stumbling more than walking, each step slower than the last. He didn't call out, didn't raise a hand, just kept moving like stopping wasn't an option he was allowed to take. By the time he reached her porch, he didn't knock. He barely made it to the first step before his weight gave out, collapsing against the boards with a dull, final sound. Eleanor didn't rush. She never rushed anymore. She stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath her boots, and looked down at the stranger. A cowboy, by the look of him. Dust-covered hat, worn leather vest, hands that had seen hard work, and blood, dark, soaking through his sleeve, spreading slow but steady. He was breathing. Barely. For a long moment, she said nothing. The wind shifted. Somewhere far off, a horse whinnied. Eleanor's eyes lifted to the horizon. Nothing yet, but something was coming. It always did. She looked back at the man. A stranger. Trouble. The kind of trouble she had buried once and sworn never to invite again. Her hand hovered near the door behind her. Warm light inside. Safe. Quiet. Then she noticed something else. Not the blood. Not the exhaustion. His hand, still gripping something tight. A small, worn piece of cloth. Torn. Not his. Eleanor exhaled slowly. The kind of breath that came before a decision that couldn't be undone. You picked the wrong house, she murmured under her breath. But her hands were already moving. She knelt down, slid her arm under his shoulder, and with more strength than she looked capable of, pulled him across the threshold. The door shut behind them with a soft click. Outside, the wind kept moving, and far in the distance, hoofbeats began to rise. The cabin smelled of warm oil and old wood, the kind of place that held memories in the walls whether you wanted them or not. And Eleanor Hayes worked in silence, her hand steady as she cut away the torn fabric from the cowboy's sleeve, revealing the wound beneath. Not fresh, but not old either, the kind that came from running too far without stopping. She poured water from a dented kettle into a basin, steam rising soft into the dim light. And for a moment the only sound was his breathing. Shallow, uneven, like each breath had to be convinced to stay. You are not dying here, she said quietly, not to him, not really, but to the room itself, as if the walls needed reminding. She cleaned the wound with careful pressure, her touch firm but not unkind, the way someone worked who had done this before, long before the world went quiet around her. His hand twitched, still gripping that torn piece of cloth, and she noticed the stitching now, small, deliberate, not something a man like him would carry without reason. She did not take it from him. Instead, she wrapped his arm with clean linen, binding it tight enough to hold, loose enough to let him breathe. Outside, the wind shifted again, and this time the sound beneath it was clearer, distant but growing. Hoofbeats, more than one. Eleanor paused, just for a second, listening the way a person listens when they already know the answer. Then she stood, moving to the window, the glass dusty, barely clear, but enough to see the horizon. Nothing yet, just darkness settling in layers, but the sound was there, steady. Patient, coming closer, she turned back to the man, studying his face now. The lines there, the exhaustion, the kind that does not come from one bad night, but from many. What did you do? She asked softly, though she knew he would not answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The question hung in the air anyway, because questions mattered even when answers did not. She moved to the small stove, adding another piece of wood, the flame catching slow, then steady, casting longer shadows across the room. Time passed in small, quiet pieces, the kind you only notice when you are waiting for something you cannot stop. His breathing steadied, just slightly, enough to tell her he was holding on. Outside, the hoofbeats were closer now, no longer distant, no longer uncertain. Eleanor stepped toward the door, her hand hovering near the latch, not opening it, just feeling its presence, the line between inside and out, between choice and consequence. She had lived on one side of that line for 12 years, untouched, unseen, and now it stood there again, asking something of her. She glanced back once more at the man on her table, then toward the rifle mounted above the fireplace, untouched, gathering dust, and then back to the door. The sound outside slowed, not stopping, but changing, spreading out, surrounding rather than approaching. And in that moment, Eleanor Hayes understood something simple and heavy. They had not come searching blindly. They had come knowing exactly where to stop. The silence outside did not break. It settled, thick and deliberate, like the land itself was holding its breath, and Eleanor Hayes kept her hand on the door latch without opening it, feeling the faint vibration of hooves shifting in the dirt just beyond the wood, not charging, not retreating, just waiting, the kind of waiting that meant patience, the kind that meant certainty. She stepped back slowly, her boots barely making a sound against the worn floorboards, and turned toward the table, where the cowboy lay, his face pale beneath the lamplight, but no longer as distant as before, his breathing deeper now, steadier, as if whatever had been chasing him had not reached inside just yet. "You brought them here," she said quietly, not accusing, not forgiving, just stating what the night had already decided. His fingers moved then, tightening slightly around that piece of cloth, and for the first time his eyes opened, not wide, not panicked, just enough to see, just enough to understand where he was. He looked at her, not confused, not afraid, but searching, as if placing her in a story he had not expected to be part of. "You should not have opened that door," he said, his voice rough, each word pulled slow like it cost him something. Eleanor did not answer right away. She moved to the basin, wringing out the cloth in silence. The water now tinted faintly from the work she had done. "And yet I did," she replied, calm, steady, like the decision had already passed beyond regret. Outside, a boot stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under the weight, not rushed, not aggressive, just present. Then another step, then stillness again. Whoever stood out there was not hiding, and not asking. Eleanor glanced toward the rifle on the wall, still untouched, then back to the man. "Who are they?" she asked, not raising her voice, not lowering it either. He swallowed, the motion small but visible, his eyes shifting toward the door, then back to her. "Men who do not travel without reason," he said, and something in the way he said it made the room feel smaller, not from fear, but from truth. Eleanor studied him for a long moment, the kind of look that measured more than words. Then she turned toward the door, her steps slow, deliberate, the boards speaking softly beneath her weight. Outside, the figures shifted, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting to her movement like they had been expecting it all along. She stopped just short of the latch, her hand hovering there again. That same line between inside and out, between what she had chosen and what it would cost, behind her. The cowboy pushed himself slightly upward, not standing, not ready, but present. "If you open that door," he said quietly, "there is no turning it back." Eleanor Hayes rested her fingers against the wood, feeling the grain beneath her skin, old, worn, familiar. Then she closed her eyes for just a moment, long enough to remember a fire, a loss, a silence that had lasted 12 years, and when she opened them again, her hand did not shake. "Nothing out here ever turns back," she said, and then, with one steady motion, she lifted the latch. The door opened without a sound, just a slow shift of wood against frame, and the night air slipped inside carrying dust, leather, and something else Eleanor Hayes had not felt in years. The presence of many men who knew exactly why they had come. She did not step back. She did not reach for the rifle. She simply stood there, framed in lamplight, as the figures on her porch came into view, not rushing, not threatening, just standing in a line that stretched beyond the edge of her vision. There, horses waiting behind them, still and quiet, as if even the animals understood the weight of this moment. The man closest to her was older than the rest, not by years alone, but by the way he held himself, steady, deliberate, his hat casting a shadow across his eyes, yet his hands were visible, open at his sides, not reaching, not ready, just present. He looked at Eleanor first, not past her, not around her, but directly at her, as if she was the one he had come to see, and for a long second, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that does not come from uncertainty but from choice. Behind her, the faint sound of movement from the table reminded her the cowboy was still there, still breathing, still part of whatever this was becoming. The man on the porch removed his hat slowly, the motion unhurried, deliberate, revealing hair touched with gray and a face marked more by time than by hardship. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, even, carrying across the porch without force. "We are looking for someone." Eleanor did not answer right away. She studied him the way she had studied storms in years past, not for what they showed, but for what they might bring. "People usually do not bring this many men for one person," she replied, her tone calm, not challenging, not welcoming, just true. A faint shift moved through the line behind him, not tension, not impatience, something closer to restraint, as if each man held himself carefully. Within a line he would not cross without reason. The older man nodded once, as if acknowledging her words rather than correcting them. "He came this way," he said, "and we intend to speak with him. Not take, not seize, not demand, just speak." The words settled in the air between them, simple but heavy. Eleanor's eyes did not leave his face, but her awareness stretched beyond him now, to the others, to the way none of them stepped forward, none of them reached for anything at their sides, to the quiet that held them all in place. "You have already found where he came," she said softly. "The question is why you followed." The man's gaze shifted then, just briefly, past her shoulder, toward the dim light inside, toward the figure that waited beyond the threshold. And something changed, not in his posture, not in his voice, but in the weight behind his eyes, recognition, or perhaps confirmation. He replaced his hat slowly, his hand steady, then took one step forward onto the porch, not crossing the threshold, not yet, just enough to close the distance by a single pace. "Because what he carries does not belong to him alone," he said, and the words did not sound like accusation. They sounded like responsibility. Behind Eleanor, the cowboy drew a slow breath, deeper than before, as if the moment had reached him fully now, and without turning, without asking. Eleanor understood something she had not expected when she opened that door. These men had not come to claim a life. They had come to answer one. The words settled heavier than the dust on the porch, and Eleanor Hayes did not move aside. Not yet. She let the silence stretch just long enough to measure the truth inside it. "What a man carries is his business," she said quietly, her voice neither sharp nor soft, just steady, the kind of steady that came from years of having nothing left to lose. The older man did not flinch, did not argue. He simply nodded once, as if he had expected that answer. "Most days," he replied, "that would be true." His eyes shifted again, not to challenge her, but to acknowledge something beyond her, something inside that small cabin that had already changed the course of this night. Behind Eleanor, the cowboy shifted on the table, the faint sound of wood creaking under his weight breaking through the stillness. And then his voice came, low, worn, but clear enough to reach the porch. "That is far enough," he said, not loud, not commanding, but final. Eleanor did not turn immediately. She kept her eyes on the man in front of her, watching how he reacted, and for the first time, something passed across his face that was not control, not calculation, but recognition, the kind that comes when a long road finally ends where it was always meant to. The men behind him did not step forward, did not shift their hands. They simply waited, as if this moment did not belong to them, as if it never had. Eleanor stepped aside then, just one pace, not inviting, not surrendering, just allowing the line between outside and inside to open wider. The older man did not rush. He stepped forward slowly, crossing the threshold with the kind of respect usually reserved for places that mattered. The others remained where they were, still as posts. The air inside the cabin felt different now, tighter, not from fear, but from something gathering, something nearing its end. The cowboy had pushed himself upright, one hand braced against the edge of the table, the other still holding that torn piece of cloth, his face pale but steady, his eyes fixed on the man who now stood a few feet away. Neither of them spoke right away. And in that silence, Eleanor saw it clearly. This was not a meeting of hunter and hunted. This was something older, something unfinished. "You took longer than I expected," the cowboy said at last, a faint breath of something like a smile passing through his voice. The older man removed his hat again, slower this time, not as a greeting, but as a gesture of something deeper. "We had to be certain," he replied, his tone carrying no accusation, only weight. "Certain of what?" Eleanor asked. Before either of them could continue, her voice cutting through the quiet not as interruption, but as necessity. Both men looked at her then, and for a moment, she stood between two stories that had been moving long before she opened her door. The cowboy lifted the cloth slightly, just enough for the lamplight to catch its edge, revealing the stitching more clearly now, a pattern, deliberate, unmistakable. The older man's eyes dropped to it, and whatever doubt had remained seemed to fall away in that single glance. "Certain that it reached the right hands," he said softly, and the words did not belong to the present alone. They carried something from before, something carried across miles and silence and time. Eleanor felt the shift then, subtle but undeniable. The tension that had filled the porch was not tightening. It was easing, not into comfort, but into resolution. And for the first time since the door had opened, she understood that whatever danger had followed that man to her doorstep, it was no longer pointed at him. It had been something else all along, something he had been carrying not to escape, but to deliver. The room held its breath in a way that felt almost human, like the walls themselves were listening. And Eleanor Hayes stood just off to the side now, no longer between them, but not removed either, her presence still anchoring the space as the two men faced each other across a few feet of worn floorboards. The cowboy's hand tightened slightly around the cloth, then loosened, as if the weight of it had finally changed. "I was not sure I would make it this far," he said quietly, his voice carrying no pride, only truth. The older man stepped closer, not invading, not pressing, just closing the distance enough to see clearly. "You were not meant to make it alone," he replied, and there was something in that answer that settled deeper than the words themselves. Eleanor watched the exchange without interruption, her eyes moving between them, reading what was not being said, the kind of reading that comes from long years of silence. The cowboy shifted his weight, steadying himself, then slowly extended his hand, offering the torn piece of cloth forward. It looked small in the space between them, simple, almost forgettable, but the moment it left his grip, the room seemed to change, as if something unseen had finally reached its end. The older man did not take it immediately. He looked at it first, really. Looked, his eyes tracing the stitching, the pattern, the careful work that had gone into something so easily carried. And when he finally reached out, his hand did not tremble, but it did not rush either. He accepted it with a quiet that felt heavier than any word. Behind him, the men on the porch shifted for the first time in a way that carried meaning, not tension, not readiness, but recognition. Like a line drawn long ago had just been crossed. Eleanor stepped closer then, just one pace, her voice soft but clear. "What is it?" she asked, not out of curiosity alone, but because the night had earned that question. The older man held the cloth carefully, turning it slightly so the lamplight caught the thread. "It is a promise," he said, and the word did not sound simple. It sounded lived. The cowboy exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry days with it. "One I was not sure I would keep," he admitted, his gaze lowering for just a moment before lifting again, steady. The older man shook his head once, not in disagreement, but in understanding. "You kept it the moment you chose to carry it," he said, and the weight in his voice made it clear that the journey had mattered as much as the arrival. Outside, the wind moved again, softer now, less restless, as if the land itself had recognized the shift. Eleanor looked from one man to the other, then to the cloth now resting in the older man's hand, and something in her chest, long quiet, stirred, not memory, not pain. Something quieter, something steadier. "And now," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but steady enough to hold. "What happens next?" The older man lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time, There was something like respect there, not given lightly, not offered easily, but present all the same. Now, he said, we make sure the promise does not end here. And behind him, one by one, the men on the porch removed their hats, not in ceremony, not in show, but in quiet acknowledgement of something completed and something just beginning. The hats came off one by one, not as a performance, not for show, but with a quiet weight that settled deeper than any words, and Eleanor Hayes felt it before she understood it. The shift in the air, the way the tension that had wrapped around her cabin like a storm now eased into something steadier, something grounded. The older man stepped back just half a pace, not retreating, but allowing space, his hand still holding the cloth as if it mattered more than anything else he had carried across those miles. You rode through the night for this, Eleanor said, her voice calm, but no longer distant. There was something in it now, something that had not been there before. The older man nodded once. Not just for this, he replied, his eyes moving briefly toward the cowboy, but for what it stands for. The cowboy leaned back slightly against the table, his strength not fully returned but no longer fading. And there was something different in his posture now, not guarded, not hunted, but settled, as if the weight he had carried was no longer his alone. It was never meant to stay with me, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the fatigue that still lingered in his body. Eleanor studied him, really studied him now, seeing not just the man who had stumbled onto her porch, but the road behind him, the distance, the purpose, the reason he had kept moving when stopping would have been easier. Then why you? She asked, not accusing, just seeking the shape of the truth. The cowboy let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before lifting again. Because I was the only one left who could carry it without breaking it, he said, and the words did not sound like pride. They sounded like responsibility. The older man gave a faint nod, the kind that comes when something unspoken is finally said out loud. Outside, the men shifted again, but not with impatience, not with pressure, more like a quiet acknowledgement passing through them, a shared understanding that the purpose of their journey had reached its end inside that small cabin. Eleanor turned slightly, her eyes moving toward the open door, toward the line of men standing beyond it. And for the first time, she saw them not as a threat, not as strangers, but as something else entirely. Witnesses, each one holding a piece of a story she had only just stepped into. And you all came to see it finished, she said, more to herself than to them. The older man answered anyway. We came to make sure it was honored, he said, his voice carrying that same quiet weight. Eleanor looked back at him, then at the cloth in his hand, and something in her chest shifted again, something old, something she had buried when she chose to live alone. Out here, she said slowly, people do not travel this far for promises. The older man met her gaze without hesitation. Then maybe it is time they remember why they should, he replied, and the words did not sound like a challenge. They sounded like truth waiting to be accepted. The cowboy straightened slightly, his strength returning in small, steady pieces. You should go, he said, not to push them away, but as if the next step had already been decided. The older man looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, not in agreement alone, but in respect. We will, he said, but not before we finish what began with you. And with that, he turned slightly toward the door, and for the first time, the men outside moved as one, not forward, not inward, but downward, boots pressing into the dirt as knees met the ground in quiet unison, not forced, not commanded, but chosen. And Eleanor Hayes stood in the doorway, watching as those who had arrived in silence now lowered themselves in something deeper than respect, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The sound of knees meeting dirt did not echo. It settled, quiet and final, like something long carried had finally been set down. And Eleanor Hayes stood there in the doorway, the warm light behind her stretching across the ground where those men now knelt, their hats held low, their heads bowed, not in defeat, not in shame, but in something far more deliberate, something chosen, the kind of choice that does not come easy to men who spend their lives riding hard and speaking little. The older man remained standing for a moment longer, his gaze moving across them, not to command, but to acknowledge. Then slowly, with no one telling him to, he lowered himself as well, one knee pressing into the dust, the cloth still held. carefully in his hand. And in that single motion, whatever distance had remained between them and the man inside the cabin seemed to disappear. Eleanor felt it, not as a change in the air, but as a quiet understanding settling into place. She stepped forward onto the porch, her boots making a soft sound against the wood, her eyes moving from one face to another, none of them looking up, none of them breaking the stillness. And for the first time since the night began, she realized they had not come to take anything. They had come to give something back. Behind her, the cowboy moved closer to the doorway, slower now, steadier. One hand braced lightly against the frame as he stepped into the edge of the light, his presence not announced, not forced, just there. And as he appeared, a subtle shift passed through the line of men, not movement, but awareness, as if they had been waiting for that exact moment. The older man lifted his head slightly, not fully, just enough to see him, and, for a long second, the two men held each other's gaze without speaking. Then the older man extended his hand forward, offering the cloth back, not as something returned, but as something shared. It was never meant to belong to one man, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the stillness without effort. The cowboy looked at it, then at him, and slowly, carefully, he stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between them. His movements measured, not from fear, but from respect. He reached out, not to take the cloth fully, but to place his hand over it, both men holding it at once. The fabric caught between their palms like a bridge between two journeys. Eleanor watched in silence, her hands resting at her sides, her breath steady, as if she understood that this moment did not need words from her. The older man's voice came again, softer now. You carried it through miles that would have broken most men, he said, and you did not let it fall. The cowboy shook his head, slightly, a faint shadow of something passing across his expression. I almost did, he admitted, and there was no shame in it, only truth. The older man gave a small nod. But you did not, he replied, and in that answer, the weight of the journey found its meaning. The cloth remained between them for a moment longer. Then slowly, together, they lowered it, not to the ground, but to the space between them, as if placing it where it could no longer be carried by one alone. And one by one, the men behind them lifted their heads, not rising yet, not breaking the posture, but no longer hidden. Their faces now visible in the early light beginning to touch the horizon, and Eleanor Hayes stood there, watching as the first hint of morning reached across the land, illuminating a scene she would never have believed the night before. A line of men who had arrived like a storm, now kneeling in quiet unity, not because they had been forced to, but because they had chosen to remember something most people out here had long forgotten. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept slowly across the land, a thin line of pale gold stretching over the horizon, touching the dust, the horses, the still figures kneeling in quiet formation. And Eleanor Hayes felt the light reach her face as she stood on that porch, watching something she had never expected to witness in all her years of solitude. The cowboy and the older man still stood close, their hands no longer holding the cloth together, but neither stepping away from it, as if distance now mattered less than what had already been understood. The men behind them remained on one knee, but their posture had changed, no longer bowed, no longer hidden, their heads lifted slightly, eyes open, present, aware, the kind of awareness that comes after something settles deep inside a man. The older man finally rose, slow and steady, brushing the dust from his knee with a quiet motion, not in a hurry, not breaking the moment, just continuing it. One by one, the others followed, not all at once, but in a rhythm that felt natural, like breathing returning after being held too long. And still, no one reached for anything at their side. No one spoke out of turn. The silence remained, but it was no longer heavy. It was clear. Eleanor stepped down from the porch then, her boots touching the ground between them, not as an outsider anymore, but not fully part of them either. Something in between, something that had formed the moment she chose to open her door. She looked at the men, then at the cowboy, then back at the older man. You rode hard for something that does not weigh much, she said quietly, her eyes resting on the small piece of cloth now held gently in the older man's hand. He gave a faint nod. Some things only seem small until you lose them, he replied. And the truth in his voice did not need explanation. The cowboy exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing for the first time since he had crossed her threshold. "It is not mine anymore," he said, and there was something in those words that felt like release, not loss. The older man looked at him, then at Eleanor, and for a brief moment, something softer passed through his expression, something that did not belong to the road or the dust or the long miles behind them. "It was never meant to be kept," he said, then turned slightly, gesturing with a small motion of his hand, not commanding, just guiding. One of the men stepped forward, younger than the rest, his movements careful, respectful, and when he reached the older man, he stopped, waiting. The cloth was passed to him without ceremony, without speech, just a simple transfer, and yet the way he received it, both hands open, head slightly lowered, made it clear that nothing about it was ordinary. Eleanor watched that exchange closely, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. "And now he carries it," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. The older man shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "Now we all do." And the words settled over the group like the light settling across the land, not loud, not forced, just present. The cowboy looked at the younger man, then at the others, and something in his expression shifted, not relief, not pride, but recognition, as if he understood at last that the road he had walked alone had never truly been his to carry alone. Eleanor turned her gaze back to the horizon, the sun now lifting higher, burning away the last of the night, and in that quiet morning, surrounded by men who had arrived as strangers and now stood as something else entirely, she realized that the world outside her door had not come to take from her. It had come to remind her of something she had almost forgotten, that even in a place as wide and empty as this, no one truly carries anything alone. The morning settled fully over the land, and with it came a quiet that no longer felt empty. The kind of quiet that follows something completed rather than something waiting to begin, and Eleanor Hayes remained where she stood, just a few steps from her porch, watching as the men adjusted not their positions, but their purpose. The younger man who now held the cloth stepped back into line, not at the front, not at the rear, but among them, as if what he carried was no longer above or below any. One of them, the older man, turned slightly toward Eleanor, his expression steady, but no longer guarded. "You gave him shelter when the road would not," he said, and there was no exaggeration in his tone, only acknowledgement. Eleanor did not answer right away, her eyes drifting briefly toward the cabin behind her, the open door, the faint warmth still spilling out into the morning air, then back to him. "I opened a door," she said simply. "What walked through it was not mine to decide." The older man gave a faint nod, as if that answer held more truth than anything he might have expected. Behind him, a few of the men began to move toward their horses, not in haste, not with urgency, just the natural motion of men who knew when it was time to leave. The sound of leather shifting and reins being gathered rose softly into the air, blending with the wind that had finally calmed. The cowboy stood near the edge of the porch now, his weight more balanced, his presence more certain. Though the lines of the road still lingered in his face, he looked at Eleanor, really looked this time, not as a stranger who had found shelter, but as someone who had chosen something that changed the course of his journey. "You did not have to let me in," he said quietly, his voice carrying that same rough edge, but steadier now. Eleanor met his gaze without hesitation. "Out here," she replied. "Sometimes the only thing a person can choose is whether to leave a man outside." The words hung between them, simple, but carrying something deeper than either of them chose to explain. The older man watched that exchange without interrupting, then stepped back, creating space once more, not distancing himself, but allowing what needed to pass between them to do so without weight. The cowboy gave a small nod, the kind that holds gratitude without needing to name it, then turned his attention back to the group, to the road that waited beyond them. "You will carry it farther than I did," he said, his eyes resting briefly on the younger man who now held the cloth. The younger man did not speak, but his grip tightened slightly, not from fear, but from understanding. The older man lifted his hand in a small gesture, and the remaining men began to mount their horses, one by one. The movement steady, practiced, the kind that comes from years on the road. And yet there was something different in it now, something quieter, more deliberate, as if the miles ahead were not just distance, but purpose. Eleanor stepped back toward her porch, not retreating, but returning to the place that had been hers for so long, her hand brushing lightly against the doorframe as she watched them prepare to leave. And as the first horse turned toward the open land, the older man paused, looking back once more, not at the cabin, not at the road, but at her. "Not many would have done what you did," he said, his voice carrying across the short distance. Without strain, Eleanor held his gaze for a moment, then gave the smallest shake of her head. "Most people would," she replied, "if they remembered how." The older man considered that, then nodded once, as if accepting something he would carry with him beyond this place. And with that, he turned, guiding his horse forward, the others following in quiet formation, not as they had arrived, but as something steadier, something resolved. And Eleanor Hayes stood there in the doorway of her cabin, watching as the line of riders moved across the open land, growing smaller with each passing second, until they became nothing more than shapes against the morning light, and then even that was gone, leaving only the dust, the wind, and the memory of what had passed through her door when she chose not to close it. The dust settled long after the riders disappeared, hanging low over the earth like a memory that refused to leave, and Eleanor Hayes remained standing in the doorway, her hand resting lightly against the wood, as if the frame itself had become something different, something more than just a boundary between inside and out. The cabin behind her was quiet again, the kind of quiet she had known for years, but it no longer felt the same. It carried something new, something left behind by voices that had spoken little but meant much. She stepped inside slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath her boots in a familiar rhythm, and for a moment she simply stood there, looking at the table where the cowboy had rested, the basin of water now still, the cloths folded neatly where she had left them, everything as it had been, and yet not. She moved closer, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, remembering the weight that had been there, the breath, the presence, the choice she had made without knowing where it would lead. Outside, the wind picked up again, softer now, carrying no urgency, just movement, the kind that passes through without asking. Eleanor turned toward the door once more, her gaze drifting out across the empty land, the road stretching wide and open, untouched again, as if nothing had happened, as if no line of men had stood there at dawn, as if no promise had passed through her hands without ever being hers to hold. She stepped back onto the porch, the sunlight warmer now, spreading across the ground where the marks of boots and knees were still visible in the dust. She looked at them for a long moment, not with curiosity, not with doubt, but with understanding, the kind that settles slowly and stays. "You left something behind," she said quietly, though there was no one there to hear it. And yet the words did not feel wasted, they felt placed, like a stone set where it needed to be. She walked a few steps forward, her boots pressing into the same ground those men had knelt upon, and she paused, looking down at the faint impressions, then out again toward the horizon, the same horizon she had watched for 12 years without expecting it to bring anything but distance. And now it had brought something else entirely, something she had not asked for, but had not turned away, a reminder, perhaps, or something closer to a question. She turned back toward the cabin, her hand reaching for the door, but she did not close it right away. She left it open, just slightly, just enough for the light to move freely in and out, just enough for the silence inside to feel less like an ending and more like a space waiting to be filled again. And as she stood there, between the inside she knew and the outside she had once chosen to leave behind, Eleanor Hayes realized something she had not allowed herself to consider in a long time, that maybe the world had not forgotten her. It had simply been waiting for her to open the door again. The door stayed open longer than it had in years, not wide, not inviting, just enough to let the air move through without asking permission. And Eleanor Hayes found herself standing there again as the sun climbed higher, watching the light shift across the ground where the marks in the dust had begun to fade, not erased, not forgotten, just softened by time and wind. She stepped inside once more, slower now, as if each movement carried more weight than it had the day before. The cabin felt different in a way she could not name, not fuller, not emptier, just changed. She moved to the small table by the window, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood absent-mindedly, her eyes drifting toward the road again, expecting nothing, and yet no longer certain that nothing would come. The kettle on the stove had gone cold, the basin emptied, the cloths folded away, every sign of the night before carefully returned to its place. And still, something remained, not an object, not a sound, but a presence, a quiet shift in how the space held her. She sat down slowly, the chair creaking beneath her weight, and for the first time in a long while, she did not fill the silence with movement. She let it sit, let it breathe, the kind of silence that no longer pressed in but opened outward. Her gaze settled on the doorway, still ajar, the line of light stretching across the floor like a path that had not been there before, and she found herself remembering not the men, not the horses, but the moment before it all began, the hesitation, the hand on the latch, the choice that had seemed small at the time. She exhaled softly, her shoulders lowering. It was never about the road, she murmured, though no one was there to answer. And yet the words did not feel empty, they felt understood. Outside, a faint sound carried on the wind, distant at first, almost easy to miss. Then clearer, not hoofbeats in a line, not a group moving as one, just a single rhythm, uneven, slower, and Eleanor's eyes lifted, not with alarm, not with urgency, but with something else, something closer to recognition. She did not stand right away. She did not rush to the door. She simply listened, letting the sound come to her, letting it take shape before she chose what it meant. The rhythm grew closer, steady in its own way, not strong, not forceful, but determined, and as it reached the edge of her land, she finally rose, her steps measured, her hand once again finding the doorframe as she stepped onto the porch. The horizon stretched out before her, wide and open, and there, just beyond the bend in the road, a single rider approached, not part of a group, not carrying the weight of many, just one, moving forward without hesitation, without pause. Eleanor watched for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shifted slightly, not stepping back, not closing the door, just standing there, exactly where she had stood before, the line between inside and out still open, still waiting. And as the rider drew nearer, the morning light catching on the dust behind him, she realized something quiet and certain. The world had not finished with her door yet. The rider did not rush, and that was the first thing Eleanor Hayes noticed, not the dust behind him, not the way the morning light caught along his shoulders, but the pace, steady and unafraid, like a man who was not chasing anything and not running from it either. She remained where she stood on the porch, one hand resting against the frame, the door still open behind her, the line of shadow and light falling across the floor just as it had the moment everything began. The rider drew closer until the details took shape. A young man, not worn by years yet, but marked by distance all the same, his clothes simple, his posture straight, and when he reached the edge of her yard, he slowed his horse to a stop without being asked, without needing to be told. He looked at her, not with hesitation, not with boldness, but with something quieter, something that carried intention. He removed his hat slowly, holding it against his chest. "Ma'am," he said, his voice clear but respectful, and Eleanor did not answer right away. She studied him the way she had studied the others, not searching for danger, but for truth. "You came alone," she said at last, her tone even. The young man nodded once. "I was told to," he replied, and there was no confusion in his words, only purpose. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in thought. "Told by who?" she asked, and the young man hesitated just long enough to show that the answer mattered. Then he reached into his coat slowly, carefully, and brought out a small piece of cloth, worn at the edges, stitched in a pattern she had seen before. Her gaze dropped to it, and something in her chest stilled, not from surprise, but from recognition. "They said the road does not end where you leave it," he continued, his voice softer now. "It ends where someone else chooses to carry it forward." Eleanor looked from the cloth to the young man, then past him, out toward the horizon where the riders had vanished hours before, and for a moment, the years she had spent alone seemed to fold in on themselves, not erased, not undone, but placed into something larger than she had allowed them to be. She stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between them slowly, her boots pressing into the same ground that had held so many others just hours before. The young man did not move. He waited, holding the cloth with both hands. offering it without reaching too far, without stepping too close. Eleanor stopped a few feet away, her eyes steady on his, then on the cloth. And without a word, she extended her hand, not to take it fully, but to touch it. Just the edge, just enough to feel the thread beneath her fingers. The weight of something that did not belong to one person, did not belong to one moment. The young man's breath eased slightly, not from relief, but from understanding, and Eleanor felt it then, clear and certain, the same quiet truth that had passed through her door the night before, that what she had done was not an ending, it was a beginning she had not chosen, but had not refused. She withdrew her hand slowly, leaving the cloth with him, and looked back toward her cabin, the door still open, the light still waiting, then back to the young man. "You can come in," she said, her voice calm, not inviting, not hesitant, just certain, and as he guided his horse forward, stepping into the space she had once kept closed to the world, Eleanor Hayes turned and walked inside without looking back, the door remaining open behind her, not as a gesture, not as a sign, but as something simpler, something truer, a choice made once, and then again, and again, until it no longer felt like a choice at all, but a way of being, and out there, beyond the porch, beyond the dust and the miles and the silence, the land stretched on as it always had, unchanged, and yet, for those who passed through that door, nothing would ever feel quite the same again.